Hello, everyone. Today we have Ms. Nirva Patel, who serves as the Executive Director of the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. She's an animal rights campaigner and animal policy researcher who's worked in both the US and India. She is an executive producer of the Netflix original documentaries, The Game Changers, Meet Me Halfway, and The End of Medicine. Nirva serves on the board of Farm Sanctuary, America's first shelter for farm animals, and even the International Vegan Film Festival. As you can already tell, she is one of the coolest people I've invited onto the podcast. I cannot thank you enough for being able to make time to talk today.
Thank you, Karthik. It is lovely to be here. And I do want to make one small correction. So when I took this position at Harvard Law School as the executive director, I did step off of the boards. I stepped off of 5 boards in order to maintain neutrality in the movement. So, but yes, Farm Sanctuary, I was previously the board chair, amazing organization. I recommend all of you to go visit in upstate New York or outside of LA. But it's great to be here. And thank you. It's lovely to meet you and understand your work in India.
Yep. So now I'm going to ask a few questions about culture and how that plays a role in animal welfare, a bit about some of the films that you've helped with, as well as animal law and your work at HLS. So first on religion and culture, my first question is, to what extent do you believe that cultural influences contribute to India's distinction as having the world's largest vegetarian population, considering that Ahimsa is a significant principle in various Indian religions like Jainism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism?
Yeah, I think India has great potential to be probably the leader in the fight towards a more compassionate world that protects animals because of all of the dharmic religions that are in India, which are premised on the basis of ahimsa. So it is one of those, like, we don't have to make the case in India that we should lead nonviolent lives. That case has already been made. What we have to do is provide more transparency in the industries that are now popping up all over India as we move towards a more industrialized society. So the transparency of the dairy industry is often misunderstood. And I think that even so culturally, I grew up with the Jain philosophy and I grew up vegetarian. And, the Jains have one of the most religious, like the most strictest diets with respect to ahimsa. So most practicing Jains will not eat meat or have never eaten meat. I have never eaten meat. But the problem is that dairy there seems to be this dairy exception with it that lives within Jainism. And I have spoken at keynotes about this, and I write about this, and I even led a campaign in the United States with all of the Jain centers to encourage a vegan practice, because while dairy many years ago may not have been as violent as it is today, it is absolutely horrific what cows go through, not only in India, but everywhere in the world. And even if we look to the past and we look at scriptures and we say, well, dairy seemed to be an acceptable form of consumption because we didn't do it all the time, or, the animal was well taken care of, or only a little bit was taken. I question that philosophy, because you're still taking from an animal who is not voluntarily giving you anything. That animal was most likely a water buffalo tied up to your house, living in unnatural conditions. So no matter how you look at dairy from a cultural perspective, at least from the Jain perspective, there is no dairy exception.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of Indian religions are against root vegetables. So, they don't allow people to eat garlic or, even go as far as carrots. And I think that if they're going to be strict on these foods, I think they should also extend that principle to dairy as well.
Exactly.
My next question is, a lot of other cultures and religions don't emphasize enough the importance of not being violent against animals. Is it more difficult to work in those countries? are there efforts to like reinterpret doctrines? So I know that there has been some work to kind of look at Islamic scriptures and explain how animals hold a lot of value in those cultures and religions.
Yes, of course, there's immense opportunity. In fact, the faculty professor of our program is writing a book called Halal Meat, where she does look at those, exactly what you talked about, that, history is often written by a small number of people. And I think, we're at a time, especially in the animal rights movement and the animal welfare movement, to question some of that history and who wrote that, that history. But there's always, when you dig deep into scriptures and you dig deep into writings and the history of religion, you'll find that there's more commonality among all the religions, and all of them, pretty much all of them, will advocate for a nonviolent lifestyle. And that can be extended to animals too. And in terms of like other countries, this morning I was at a conference via Zoom in China, and it was the 2023 China Vegan Summit. And the interest from the crowd was unbelievable. A country that you would otherwise kind of categorize as just a very high meat eating population. They're reading everything we're reading. They're watching everything we're watching, and they're very curious about nutrition and economies of scale and sustainability with diet and food and nutrition. So there's immense opportunity everywhere. America and Europe have kind of led the animal rights movement, but I also question that, we're pretty nascent. And I look at India, at least, and the doctrines and the scriptures and the, pandrapols and the goshalas, and all of this has been around for thousands of years, so we need to reignite what's happening in India and let the world know that we have been paying attention to animals for a long time.
Yeah, and because you mentioned this book that a faculty member is writing, is her name Professor Kristen Stilt?
Yes.
Okay, yes, because I think so she did a lot of work in like Egypt, and I remember reading into that, and I found that very interesting. So for viewers, I will link some of that work in the description so that you can go through it. My next question is about some of the limitations of these promoting animal welfare through culture, because I think that even within Hinduism, we see that dairy and fish are allowed, and people often have this tendency to solely rely what's said in the scripture instead of actually understanding what ahimsa means in a more deeper way. And I think that might mean that it's actually difficult to explain to people that their culture actually tells them that animals are important because of how rigid people are when it comes to things like culture. I think like another problem with culture, at least in India, and tell me your opinion on this, is there have been a lot of issues promoting ahimsa because of how there's a caste hierarchy, and how a lot of Hindu nationalism has emerged as a result of campaigns that say that like meat eaters are evil people. Do you think it's possible to still do a lot of meaningful work in India without alienating this base of people and offending other communities?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, this is a topic that comes up a lot, and the characterization of, activists and people kind of saying they're doing one thing, but then, protecting cows, but then violently impacting people, it never works. It doesn't resonate. So I think that you have to go back into, just the theory of compassion in everything that you do. So if you have a friend who is in a family that eats meat, and they've been raised that way, and they're on a limited budget, and this is all they know, and they have no power over their choices, we have to be compassionate. We have to be compassionate to their choices, because they're not in that position to make those changes. But what you can do is have conversations. You can be that strength. You can be that pillar. You can be that, hey, I understand where you're coming from, but these are my choices. And this is, so I think that movements can be very tricky because people will often hold the flag for a movement that they're really not, they're kind of exploiting. So, you know, in India, we're in a pluralistic society with so many religions and so many different types of like theories of thought and philosophy that the animal movement, I think, especially with dairy, I think we need to understand the history of dairy in India. It was a national movement. It was something that when the British, you know, the British actually brought in the concept of like drinking milk on a daily basis, and they would only provide that milk to fellow, you know, colonizers. And then when they left, India was like, oh, this seems like really like a good thing we should do, and everyone should start drinking milk. And even though many of the population is lactose intolerant, yeah, this sounds like a great industry. And milk was held as this national movement, and it did provide a lot of jobs. It brought the farmers together. The Amul industry was born, and then it was protected, you know, by the Bollywood, the whole Bollywood sector. And even I think when Coca-Cola tried to enter the market as another drink, the India imposed very, very high tariffs on Coca-Cola so that it couldn't compete with milk. So, you know, you kind of have to look behind, under the hood, and understand what has made, you know, these products so famous and so successful. But to me, I think the most important thing is to look at our incredible inheritance of compassion because of the dharmic philosophy that so many of us follow. And let's go back. Let's go back to before the British were there. How did we treat animals? How did we live with animals? How did we survive on most areas in India survives on a predominantly plant-based diet, and it's not expensive either. And that's another thing that people often bring up, is that you have to be rich to be vegan. You have to be able to, you know, buy kale. Well, we were never eating kale in our Indian diets. Like, I mean, my mom, we grew up in Massachusetts in a very not privileged situation. And I remember our meals were very economical. I mean, we just had like a big bag of rice, a couple of big bags of lentils, vegetables and fruits you buy on a weekly basis, and that was good. And everything was made from scratch and with very low salt and very low sugar, and we were fine. And so there is this other movement of Impossible Meat and Beyond Meat, and those are great. You know, they really kind of resonate with the, you know, the wealthy population, but it's not necessary at all to follow a vegan diet. So India has that diet, you know, which is its biggest tool. But, you know, when industry comes in and Coca-Cola comes in and all these other products come in, especially the big meat industries, we have to be very careful with how much they kind of take away from our food heritage.
Yeah, and one thing I will say is, you know, about this whole idea of like whether a plant-based diet is, you know, economical. One thing that a lot of meat corporations, so like KFC, for example, have done, or if you look at the UK, they've been able to really make sure that meat is very, very cheap. And that is just something that makes people think that meat is like the cheapest option for them. And that is a big problem, I think, because I think it's just not true that like a plant-based diet is more expensive. If anything, it's actually meant to be, you know, less expensive in a lot of countries where you don't have these meat corporations. Like in a lot of parts in India, like meat is very expensive. It is a good that people do not consume you know, regularly. And one thing that's also interesting is in China, the reason we see a lot of people eating a lot of meat is because of this idea that like eating meat correlates to like higher status. And that's because whenever people invite guests over, they often serve them meat because that kind of shows them that they are of like a higher status. And so that for that reason, it's been really difficult to promote things like tofu, even though tofu is a huge part of Chinese culture. It's kind of, you know, fading away a little bit because of how people actually look down on tofu as like an inferior form of food. And that's why, you know, we're seeing more tofu being promoted in the US and in the West where it's being received differently. So like a lot of stuff on like how meat and plant-based diets have to do with like, you know, people's ability to spend is also something that I think a lot of movements are looking into as they should be.
True. That's a good point.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask one question about some of your own work. So I've read that you have stopped the usage of ghee in like in a temple in your local community. And I'd imagine it being daunting to like object or counter a priest who obviously wants to continue with like rituals and like how things have been from like the beginning. What advice would you have to people who want to make a small change but are afraid to do so?
Yes. So I don't know if I stopped the usage of dairy in the temple, but at that time I know I did. So what happened was I went to change.org, which is a very popular petition site, and I circulated a petition to end the use of dairy in Jain temples. And this was like a few years ago. And it got a lot of signatures and a lot of attention. And then I contacted the two centers in my state, and I really didn't hear back from anybody. I emailed them, I contacted them on Facebook, and I said, look, for this very religious week in Jainism called Paryushana, can you just, avoid using dairy? But no one got back to me. No one wanted to answer. And then when I visited the temple that week, all the dairy was gone. So while they didn't want to admit to me on the phone or get into this big discussion or admit blame, or, they just probably didn't want to deal with me, they still knew what the right thing to do was. So sometimes when you think people are not listening, just know that they're absorbing, and at a later time, they might have that chance, they might resonate. So in terms of reaching people in your local community, I did another big project I did in my local community was I filed a citizens petition to ban the sale of fur. And that was something that was quite extraordinary because I live in a very conservative town. So, that while there are more people of color living in this town, it is a small population, and things in my town tend to be the same, from 100 years ago till today, which is wonderful and beautiful. But the subject of fur, a lot of people in my town have fur jackets, and it was a very unpopular opinion. But when I spoke to the crowd, I didn't judge them. I didn't criticize them. I connected with them. And my pitch was, you all love nature. We have so many trails, so many walking paths in this town. Most of you have a dog or a pet in your house. You're animal people. You love nature. And the animals that are killed in the fur industry belong like you when you walk in those woods. And I know you agree with me, but you've been fooled. You've been fooled by the industry. You've been told that these animals are happy and there's no harm to them, but you've been fooled. And so don't let them fool you. Just stop the demand. Stop the demand of fur. And it worked. So I think when you speak to anyone, first find the commonality with them, let them open the door for discussion, and then try again and again and again. Because the first time when you speak to someone, it may not resonate at all, and they might just categorize you as some vegan freak. But they are listening because they are truly. I think compassion is a human characteristic, and every one of us has it. So you just have to be very artful and strategic in bringing that out in people and extending that towards animals.
Absolutely. And you mentioned how a lot of companies try to fool consumers about the animal industry. I just wanted to jump in and add a few examples of where I've seen this happen and people haven't realized. So it's very interesting how we call pig meat pork as opposed to like pigs. And that's because it just doesn't sound like an animal. It sounds like a food product. And I'd imagine the same being true for beef, how we like label things and how companies push a certain narrative that like this is how you're supposed to call this kind of food. And then people just don't know, or like subconsciously they kind of like forget that like, this is an animal at the end of the day, and they don't know what animals are going through. And from just conversations I've had with people in my community, no one hates animals, no one wants them to suffer. It's just they don't know the scale at which these animals in these industries are being harmed. And I think that's the biggest problem in my view. It's just them not knowing in the first place. So that I would say is the thing.
It's true. I had a friend who once told me that, salmon want to die. Like they swim upstream into the mouths of bears because like they want to die. So you can eat salmon. And I was like, oh God. And then, when you talk about the late, like language is everything. But I even have friends who are like, they eat chicken fingers and chicken breast. And you just, to us, it's like, how can you eat something like that? It's so horrific. I mean, it's awful. But there is a bit of cognitive dissonance, which we talk about a lot in our movement. And when everybody around you is a good person and they're doing it and they're eating meat, but they're still good people, these are your good friends. Well, then how is all that possible at the same time? So it's some, but the good thing about our movement is we have so many different angles and ways to approach. We have the activist side, we have the corporate side, we have the legal side, we have the climate change aspects, we have the health side, we have the films, the documentaries. Everybody's at it. So I'm so grateful to see that, because at some point these structures, these monopolies of power will start to break down, and we'll start to see that, even if we can't see it right now.
Absolutely. And just one question. I know this is a bit tangential to our conversation on culture, but so in the US, the way meat works is it's a monopoly. So one thing I was thinking about was there are a lot of efforts to currently break the meat monopoly in the US, but could that actually do more harm to animals? Because the one thing about monopolies is that they charge higher prices for meat. And so if we were to break a monopoly apart, presumably that might lead to prices reducing and more meat consumption. And also, I think the ability for a monopoly to kind of do things like implement things like cage-free campaigns. Obviously, that's, I guess, the downside, because that's something that a lot of meat companies are competing with each other to do. So on the one hand, you have, like, if you're going to break down these monopolies, the price of meat could fall, and that could be bad and detrimental. But on the other hand, you have like these monopolies sitting and just being able to do whatever they want to animals, and not being able to do things like cage-free commitments. Because the thing about cage-free commitments is you see one company do it, you see another company wanting to do the same thing. So what is your take on like the meat monopoly, policy related to meat monopolies?
So monopolies are very okay, there's another part to that. It's the federal subsidization of meat. So the true cost of meat is not endured by any of these companies. So they're subsidized quite a bit. Farmers are subsidized. It's the farmers actually that that are kind of losing out on quite a bit. And if we go back to the days before the Industrial Revolution, where we just had small farmers everywhere, the price of meat would actually go up, because there wouldn't be federal subsidization of these huge. So we're actually trying to end. There's a bill that keeps getting passed into Congress called the Farm System Reform Bill, and that is exactly what Cory Booker and certain legislators are working on, is to deconstruct these monopolies to support. I mean, you're still supporting small farmers who have cows and chickens on their farms, but at some point you're reducing meat consumption in that way. Yes, reform is better when you have huge companies like Tyson and Smithfield, owning everything, and the reform does happen, that way. But for every big Tyson, you have hundreds of other mid-sized to smaller, CAFOs and smaller farms. So it's a tricky situation. I think, with respect to India, we just have to prevent these CAFOs from popping up everywhere, because once they're there, it's very hard to get to deconstruct that.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned subsidies, because I think subsidies are what are propping up these monopolies in the first place. And that's what's causing the price of meat to be artificially lowered down. And so if we see the subsidies go away, we'll not only see the prices going up, but also the monopolies going away. So I actually think getting rid of those subsidies is actually going to be something that we need to fight for. It'll be difficult, especially because there are a lot of, there's already a lot of inflation, and people, this would be really bad politically for any politician to push.
Right.
But hopefully we can find a way to kind of break apart these monopolies, while also ensuring that animals are helped.
Yeah, and it's $20 billion of subsidies, for the meat and dairy industry. And much of that is the feed the feed to feed all of the animals. So you think it's plants, you think it's like soy and corn, but it's actually food for the animals, which are then consumed at a low cost because they're further subsidized.
Yeah. So this was an interesting conversation on culture, and then we got into like a lot about what companies do in the meat industry. I want to now talk about films. And my first question is about game changers. And one thing I really liked about it was how it isn't accusatory when it talks about vegan diets, and it sounds positive. As in, when people see that documentary, they want to change. It's really different from like other documentaries like Dominion, where when you see it, you feel really bad. And that's like another way to push people into change. So what are some of the advantages of having positive documentaries? Do they, still create the same urgency that like other documentaries like Dominion create?
Yeah, I mean, they do. All of these films are amazing. And, there's an audience for every single one of them. Now, the Game Changers appealed to a crowd similarly in a similar way that like beef appeals to a crowd. Like it's associated with power and strength and success and money. So the Game Changers took all of those and basically applied all of that to plants. So they had a star-studded list of executive producers from Serena Williams and Lewis Hamilton and Arnold Schwarzenegger. And so, right then and there, celebrities sell. And these celebrities were saying, hey, we eat a plant-based diet. And they didn't focus on the ethical part of it. I mean, at the very end of the film, there was a little bit on the ethics and the climate aspects of meat, but for the most part, the film was about power, fame, success, and all on the backdrop of the plant-based movement. So that created such a successful film. I don't know if I answered your question, but these films be very, very powerful when they have positive image, even more powerful when it's a positive message versus an accusatory kind of, this is so sad and depressing. In fact, what we found when I was on the board of the International Vegan Film Festival was that the films that are kind of like they're not negative, they're actually realistic. Like, this is really what happens. Like, this is actually, we're not lying at all. This is like live footage. When you see that, people they can't see it. They can't. It's too, their lives are already so challenging. They don't want to then go home on a Friday night after a really hard work week and watch a bunch of, pigs suffering. It's really hard. So the messaging is important. So I was on a summit this morning, and that was one of the questions I got: what makes a vegan film successful? And so if you focus on the health, that is, health, power, fame, all the things that people, love, it can be very impactful.
Absolutely. And I think the thing about just having positive documentaries is that more people are going to watch it. And I also like the way that it wasn't necessarily marketed as like an animal rights or welfare film. Like, anybody wanting to like learn about their diet and how to get more healthy watched it. And I mean, that is how eventually they were led to like understand that plant-based diets are very healthy for them. This next question is about wildlife documentaries, and there's a lot of wild animal suffering in the world, and a lot of people don't realize that, because a lot of these documentaries often glamorize the lives of like polar bears, fish, and octopus. Do you think that could be, a problem for like people working in like the wild animal welfare space?
So I don't know if I understand the question. So the question is whether the popularization of wild animals like the polar bears, could have an adverse impact on like wildlife welfare. Is that? No, I mean, I don't think so. I think, there's something that so when we look at animals, we refer to them as either charismatic species or non-charismatic species. I think they're all charismatic. I think even the tiniest little mouse is charismatic. But for the public, polar bears and orcas and all of these and just these beautiful lions, all of these beautiful big wild species gain quite a bit of media attention. And I think that's all good. Anything that brings a larger audience towards animal welfare and wildlife laws is a very good thing. it's a good thing. I think it's powerful, and it then, because then that person will, be led to a website, which then they'll kind of look in the corner and say, oh, what's going on with chickens, and
Yeah.
what's going on with animals, and oh my God, labs. And so you want to just bring them in some way.
Absolutely. And I think that's one positive argument for zoos, which is that zoos actually inspire people to like care about animals. And zoo animals, obviously, they do go through suffering because they're in captivity. But there are some people who believe that like the wild is probably worse for a lot of these animals. And zoos, especially for animals that, would have gotten injured or, killed
Yeah.
because they're
Yeah.
prey, would be better.
Right, like sanctuary zoos, I get it.
Sanctuary
And
zoos.
one in Austin, Texas is pretty amazing. Now, zoos, I'm actually fundamentally, I'm opposed to the concept of a zoo, but I also know that many of the greatest activists in our movement were first inspired by a visit to the zoo. So I grapple with that concept. It's a tricky one to answer.
Absolutely. I want to now move on to some questions on animal law. And my first question is, why are live markets worse than slaughterhouses? And do you think that actually live markets can actually show a lot of the suffering that happens inside slaughterhouses and make it easier for us to actually unravel some of the abuse that's happening, because we're just capped due to like due to ag gag laws that just don't let us go into a lot of slaughterhouses in the first place.
Yeah. The ag gag laws are extremely, I mean, the terrorist laws, are horrible for our movement. But the live animal markets are particularly fascinating. And we have just released one of the probably the biggest report on live animal markets in the United States and at Harvard Law School. And our global live animal markets report will be coming out very soon. And India is one of the featured 14 countries. I think it's 14 or 16 countries that are featured in there. And I actually helped write that article. So one of the case studies is about Crawford Market in Mumbai. And that is one of our largest markets. And so the problem with live animal markets versus slaughterhouses, they're both bad, but the live animal markets, everything is sold there, from mangoes to puppies to meat. Animals are slaughtered on the spot. And then what happens is you have they're open air markets. So you have wild bird populations coming in and, creating a huge risk of zoonotic disease to the thousands of people that walk, sometimes even barefoot, into markets like Crawford Market. So it is surprising that open air markets have very little regulation, or the regulation is there actually in India, but the enforcement's not there. So a lot of the permits we found were not up to date. The inspections were not up to date. People just kind of just go on with these markets, and nothing really happens to change the safety of such live markets.
Yeah, and my next question is basically about some of the legal work that goes on. And I see a lot of work in the US that has to do with open rescue and habeas corpus cases, as well as like shareholder derivative suits. Does legal work have a limit in the US and abroad?
That's a very good question. I don't think it has a limit, because I feel that the world of animal law touches upon many aspects of law. There isn't like, it's administrative law, it's criminal law, it's property law, it's everywhere. So I think that we haven't even fully realized the universe that we are in. And I think that the law is still being established. So we are establishing precedent. We are, for the first time, you rarely get to the Supreme Court level in the US. So we're doing that now. We're establishing precedent. There is incredible potential with the laws. And every time we make progress from an animal perspective, the opposition also tries to make progress. So while Proposition 12 happened, they introduced the EATS Act, which, could basically undo all of the work of Proposition 12. So, it's a constant field that's going to be around for a long time. So I strongly encourage those of you who are interested in law and who are just compassionate people, and, you recognize the beauty of animals and the impact of animals as we live in this shared planet, to consider pursuing a path in animal law.
Absolutely. And I'm really sorry for having kept you so long. Is there anything that you wish you were asked that I didn't ask yet that you'd like to talk about?
No, I think you did a wonderful job. I'm really amazed by how articulate you are in this field and all the work that you do. And it has really been fascinating to talk to you. And I look forward to looking at all of your other podcasts too, and see who you've interviewed. But your approach is really wonderful because when you interview people from all over the world, you're going to gain insights of how we can do better, how we can reach more people, what's working here, what's not working there. And I really wish you great success, with everything that you're doing. And thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much, Nirva. This was a genuine honor. I've always been, wanting to interview you, and thank you so, so much for all that you do for animals. Your work is incredibly inspiring, and you are a role model.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you.